First of all, I wonder if you could say something about the election in the United States, but I'm still in shock, you know.
I think the world is in shock. I mean, I just never saw that coming. I must admit that I did not think Donald Trump would make an appropriate president. I still don't think so. Mm. But this is a crazy world where the UK voted for Brexit, the Americans elected Donald Trump. Mm. I mean, what can I say? For me as a thriller writer, that's great because, you know, that gives me all sorts of new material, but it's weird.
But you have written a book called Fever. I know that. And it's about this threat against nature in everywhere, environment and so on. And one of the problems with Donald Trump is, according to him, there is no threat
global
against.
Warming, yeah. Well, that's just one of many problems with Donald Trump, you know. I mean, it's crazy. But I'm just hoping that he has good people around him who will bring a little sanity to his presidency. But it's, you know, we have enough problems in South Africa, so I'm not going to worry too much about the problems that they have in America.
No. Well, we'll see.
Yeah.
Anyway. So let's go back and start with the very beginning. Can you tell us a little bit about your upbringing?
Yeah, I grew up in a very small mining town, gold mining town, on the Highveld of South Africa, about 180 kilometers from Johannesburg. And it was both a beautiful growing up because we lived on the edge of town, so I grew up in the bush, in the veld. We were constantly out. And that's one of the reasons why I write about the environment quite often, because I've seen Africa being destroyed, the environment in Africa being destroyed over the past 50 years. From the very wild, very beautiful, very natural Africa that I got to know as a child to now, there's been so much destruction. So, but it was on the one hand, very beautiful to grow up there, and on the other hand, very weird because I was born under apartheid. And to grow up and realize that you live in a country that where something is wrong and you don't know what it is because you're first too small to understand, and then when you start asking questions, your school teachers and your school principal and the priest at the church and the mayor and all the authority figures around you tell you that this is the way that things are, this is the way that things should be. And then you grow even more old and you start reading books internationally. The apartheid government banned a lot of books and newspapers and magazines, so you know, we were very cut off, but you realize something's wrong, and then if you start finding out and you start reading, then you realize that your country is regarded as an evil regime, and that is very shameful. And then you rebel against that. I rebelled against... I mean, my father was pro-apartheid, so we had these huge arguments. And it almost destroyed our relationship. And I went to university, and I remember in university there was all the banned books in South Africa you could find at the university in the library. There was a big glass enclosure that was locked, and inside that glass enclosure were all the books banned under apartheid. So I wanted to get my hands on them, I wanted to read them, I wanted to know the truth. You could only get in there if you had a research project. So I lied and I invented a research project to get my hands on these books, and that's when my eyes really opened and I started actively participating in anti-apartheid activities and that sort of thing. So that was my upbringing, you know. I mean, I think so different from any other country.
Did you have any black friends when you were a child?
Yeah, most of my friends were black when I was a kid. You know, when I was at primary school, every day after school I would meet my friends, and they were mostly black and some white friends too. And we would go down to the river and we would play there all day long. And in the evening, they would go back to the black township and I would go back to the white township. There was a black man who worked with my father, who often came to our house. I knew him very well. there was no difference, between him and white people in terms of friends and colleagues that my father had. So that was why it was so weird, because a lot of ordinary people's lives were very normal in that we mingled freely, we had a lot of contact with black people, but it was just that we couldn't go to the same school, we couldn't use the same bathrooms, we couldn't use the same swimming pool, and we couldn't live together. That was... and at first you think that that's normal, but then you realize it's not.
Oh. So it must have been wonderful for you when apartheid...
It was on so many levels wonderful. Yeah. I remember very well the day that President F.W. de Klerk made his very famous speech in which he announced that he would unban the ANC and free Mandela. I was driving from Cape Town to my place of work in Bellville, and I was listening to the speech, and I had stopped at my place of work in the parking garage and sitting listening to the speech, and when he said that he was going to free Mandela and unban the ANC, I cried like a baby, and I was in my 30s back then, so that was a very emotional moment. And it not only freed my country, it not only allowed me to be proud of my country, but it also gave me a career as an author, because I only started writing after the end of apartheid. I couldn't write under apartheid. How can you write crime fiction and have a policeman who is the representative of the state, the representative of law and order, but he works for an evil regime? I just couldn't write.
No.
So de Klerk and Mandela gave me a career as an author, and so I'm doubly grateful to them.
Oh, I see. But did you start to write when you were a child, or have you ever liked to write?
I loved. I mean, first of all, I loved reading. We had a very good library in the little town where I lived, and my father and mother encouraged us to read. So my father took us to library 2-3 times a week, and so first of all, I fell in love with books, and then I think when I was 10 or 11 years old. I realized, but I wanted to do the same thing one day. I wanted to make stories that other people would enjoy. So when I was 14, I tried to write a book. I actually wrote it. It was very bad, but I thought it was fantastic. And I gave it to my brothers to read, and they read it, and they said it was horrible. So it took me another 10 years to get over that. And in my 20s, I tried to write a book again. But, I think because of the conditions that we were living in, and because I was perhaps way too young to really write anything that was decent, I gave that up too. And it was only in my 30s when apartheid had ended, and I think I had grown up a little, that I was able to write again.
And how come you started to write novels? You were working as a journalist, weren't you? I started my career as a journalist, but again, all the newspapers in South Africa were apartheid controlled. So I got very frustrated, and I left journalism. I went into advertising. And I was working in advertising when, it was one of those strange things. You sort of, when you grow up and you have a job, I was a single parent for a long time. You think that all you have to do is work, and you forget about your love of writing. And I was in advertising, and I was asked to write a few short television scripts as advertisements, but sort of little fictional stories. And I wrote them, and I absolutely loved writing them, and I sort of rediscovered my love of writing through that. And then I started writing short stories, because I had no idea if I had any talent. So I thought, well, writing short stories is a much shorter investment of my time to see if it'll work. Writing a novel would be a 2-year journey, a lot of it, big investment, not knowing that someone would publish it. So I write short stories, and I started selling the short stories, and I wrote short stories for several years before I had the courage to start with a novel. And the reason was that I was really poor back then. I had 2 jobs, plus I took care of 2 children on my own. And the only time I had available to write was between 4 o'clock in the morning and 6 o'clock in the morning, before let's say 7 o'clock, before I had to start waking the kids and getting them ready for school.
So it took me 2 years to write that first novel. And there were, at the time, nobody was writing or publishing crime fiction in South Africa. So I really didn't know if anybody would be interested in the book. And I presented it to a publisher, and the publisher, they wanted to publish it, but for 30 years in South Africa, there was no crime fiction published, so they didn't know how to publish this book. So they published it with a very gaudy, common cover with this half-naked woman, drawing of a half-naked woman on. I mean, there was no half-naked woman in the book, but that's what they put on. Because the funny thing is that under apartheid, a lot of books were banned, and also there were very strict views on what was acceptable and what was not acceptable, and crime fiction was just not deemed acceptable. So when I presented my first crime fiction book to the publisher, they thought that they should give it a real down market look and tell people that this is an unacceptable book. The book only sold 800 back then. They printed 1,200. The book only sold 800. And they sent me a letter. My publisher sent me a letter saying, well, we're going to pulp the rest, the other 400, but if you want to buy some, you can buy them for R1 each. And I bought 20 because I thought that would be the last book that I would ever get published, and at least I'll have something to show my grandchildren. So I bought 20. I still have 20 of these books with a naked, half-naked woman on the cover in my home.
But why did you choose a crime story? Why?
You know, I didn't really choose crime fiction. I don't think I was sophisticated enough to think I want to write crime fiction. I just, I told a story that I came up with, and it was only after my second book had been published in South Africa and reviewers were starting to refer to me as the first crime fiction author in South Africa in 30 years that I looked at my work and I thought, yes, that's what I'm writing. And I think the reason why I write crime fiction is because I fell in love with crime fiction at around about the age of 14, I would say. I started reading crime fiction and I absolutely loved it. I just couldn't get enough. And I still love the genre today. And, so I think I was greatly influenced by that. But even today, I don't really think of myself as specifically a crime author. I think of myself as a storyteller, and my stories happen to be crime or suspense in general.
And why do you think that crime stories are so popular all over the world? I mean, if you go into a bookstore in Sweden and you have the 10 books that's most sold, 8 of them are
that's very good news.
Yeah, that's the way it is.
I mean, I've been asked this question before, and I always give the same answer. I think we all think we know why crime fiction is popular, but perhaps we don't really. I think one of the main reasons is that we live in a world where justice is a scarcity. I mean, life is unfair. Life is not just. And the one place that we know that we will get justice in 99% of the time is in crime fiction. But I also think crime fiction is about the real big issue of life and death. Crime fiction is about order against chaos. The role of the detective is to bring order after the chaos of a murder, for instance, because there's nothing that disrupts society as much as a murder. Most of our lives are spent trying to fix society, trying to uphold society, trying to create a society that is just and predictable and safe. And nothing disturbs that society as much as a murder. So it's a real big issue, and I think when we all read crime fiction, we want justice done. We want to see order after the chaos. And I think it gives us a very primal satisfaction to see that an injustice is fixed, that a murderer is brought to justice.
Yes, I do agree.
Right.
Yeah. And how important is research for you?
Research is very important for 2 reasons. The one is, I often tell the story, that first book of mine with a semi-naked lady on the cover, I made two very stupid mistakes because I was, you know, I was a very young author back then. I had a couple drinking wine in one scene in the book. I had a couple drinking white wine, and I said it was from a wine farm that I realized afterwards people started sending me letters saying I'm an idiot because that wine farm does not make white wine. And, you know, nobody likes to get called an idiot, so I decided there and then that I would do research properly, because I think it's very important to respect your reader and you respect your reader's intelligence, and to do your homework. So that's the one reason why I do a lot of research. The other reason is that on a very practical writing level, I think research multiplies your creative choices. Writing a story, creating a story, structuring a story is all about making creative choices. I mean, a story can go in several directions, and every choice that you make in terms of the direction that the story goes has got implications. But if you do research, the more you know about a subject, the more you have creative choices that you can make, more directions that the story can take, so that you can always choose the best direction. So that's another reason why I think research is very important.
Well, I met you before at this book fair, and then I remember you told me that it isn't so easy all the time when you had to do some research on sex workers.
Yeah.
That wasn't that easy, was it?
No, it was very hard. It was for a book called Devil's Peak, and I had a major character who was a sex worker, and it was very hard. I remember I would look at, first of all, I didn't know where to find sex workers. I knew that there were these small advertisements in the newspaper, but then I found out that those were the very cheap sex workers. And I needed, for my character, I needed an upmarket, expensive sex worker. So eventually I found out that there's a website where you can find these ladies. So I went onto the website and I started calling some of them, those that looked like the character that I had in mind. So I would call up a sex worker and say, look, my name is Deon Meyer and I'm an author and I'm doing research for a book. And they all said, oh, I've heard that one before. So it seems to me that there are a lot of guys out there who pretend to be authors doing research. So, you know, then I would give my own website address and say, please go take a look at this, and then you'll see that I'm for real. And even then, you know, those who agreed to see me, I had to win their trust. There were 3 that I eventually spoke to, and I really had to work hard to win their trust, because they're not keen to really talk about why they do that job and to tell me their life stories. But eventually I did manage to get the information that I wanted.
Mm-hmm. And there is also a story in life you told me about when you once were sitting at the airport in Johannesburg, and you were seeing a black man sitting reading about
Afrikaans
rugby.
newspaper.
Yes. Can you tell that? Because I think it's wonderful.
Yeah, I mean, you know, I think one of the things that make authors is that we are very curious about the world that we live in. And I certainly try to collect as many stories as I can. So I was flying from Johannesburg to Cape Town, and I was sitting waiting for my flight that was delayed. And in the area where we were all waiting, there was a black guy reading an Afrikaans newspaper, but even more importantly, he was reading the rugby pages, the sports pages, specifically about rugby. And I was very curious, so I went up to him and I said, please forgive me for my intrusion, but I'm very curious. Why are you reading the rugby pages? You're a black guy. Most black people in South Africa love soccer, football. So, you know, I'm keen to know how you fell in love with rugby. And he told me this amazing, amazing story. He was a soldier in the military arm of the ANC, the Mkhonto weSizwe, which means the spear of the nation. He went to Russia for training. And while in Russia for training in a military camp, there were a whole lot of South Africans. The Russian army challenged them because they're from South Africa, and South Africa is one of the world rugby powers. they challenged these ANC soldiers to a rugby game. And it was a beautiful story, and I actually adapted that story for inclusion in one of my books. And the character that I created then later became one of my protagonists in my books.
Tobela.
Tobela, yeah.
One of my favorites.
Yeah.
Yeah. But you also said that it was difficult to write as being a black man.
Yeah.
While you were obviously a white man. How could you manage that?
Well, that was a very interesting process. When I decided to create this, I mean, I wanted to create the first black protagonist of a suspense novel ever in South Africa, because there hadn't been one before. And I used this character from the previous book called Tobela, or Tiny, and he's a Xhosa. But I knew that if I, as a white Afrikaans writer, wanted to create a black Xhosa character, I was going to open myself up to some criticism if I got it wrong. And I had to be very careful. So I did research like I've never done research before. I went to the Eastern Cape where the Xhosa people lived. I spent some time there. I read every book on Xhosa history and Xhosa culture that I could get hold of. I spoke to Xhosa people everywhere I could find them, from a professor at Stellenbosch University to taxi drivers to housekeepers, etc., to really try and get a feel for what it was like to be Xhosa. So I started writing the book called Heart of the Hunter, and it was very difficult for me. I mean, I really battled. And after 50 or 60 pages, it got so bad, it got so slow, and the weight of this black character became so big that I stopped writing, and I sat back and I thought about this for a couple of weeks. And then one day I thought to myself, but maybe the reason for this is that I'm focusing on all the differences between me and Tobela, white and black, Afrikaans, Xhosa. He was part of the ANC while I wasn't. I mean, all these differences. Maybe I should start looking at what we have in common, what unites us. We both love our country, we love our families, we love our children, we care about justice, we want to do the right thing. And the moment I started looking at the character from what we have in common, everything changed. And I could go back to the book, and it was much easier writing from there on. But it was also a great life lesson that I learned. You know, if you find it hard to relate to someone else, then look at the things that unite you and not the things that divide you. So maybe we should look at Donald Trump and ask what unites us.
Blonde hair.
Right, right.
Well, and this Tobela, he's driving motorcycle in this essay. I thought it was very exciting. And so, can you explain to me the secret with motorcycling? Because I have a husband. He also have a BMW, as you have.
Right.
C2 with the roof. I don't know whether you have seen those.
Yeah, I had one myself,
Oh, you have?
Yeah,
I tell him that. And when he is in a bad mood, he's just going out, driving and so on. And when he comes back, things are quite all right. So what is it? Is it that you feel that you're young again? Or is it a feeling of freedom? Or what is it?
Yeah, there's definitely the feeling of freedom. But I think I don't ride motorcycle any longer because I don't have time. I had a big BMW Adventure off-road tourer. And to use that, you needed to go away for a week or two. And I just got too busy. But the one thing that I loved about motorcycling was that you set your thoughts free. I mean, on a motorcycle, you can't, even though, I mean, they have these intercom systems these days that work with Bluetooth, but I never had that. It was just you and the road, and so your thoughts are set free. And motorcycling is a very sensory thing. You know, when you ride in a car, you only see the surroundings. But if you're on a motorcycle, you feel the temperature, you smell the air. If you're riding through farm country, you can smell the cattle or the wildflowers, or in the Karoo, in the semi-desert, you have very fragrant shrubs. So there are many more senses involved in motorcycling, which I find very stimulating, and it sort of frees up my thoughts. But it's about the freedom too. It's about this wide open road that stretches ahead of you that has almost no limits. And it's about the adrenaline too. I mean, let's be honest. To ride a motorcycle at high speed on a twisty road is a great thrill.
You have also written a guide for people who want to go and do adventurous motorcycling in South Africa.
Yeah.
Perhaps I should give my husband that as
absolutely,
as a gift.
He would love you forever for that.
Oh dear. A very good idea then. Well, and do you know from the very beginning what is going to happen in your novels?
It's one of the most difficult things to explain is the writing process, because I don't really know how it works, and I don't want to know, because as long as it works, I think one should not fiddle with it. So if I don't make sense, please forgive me, but I know more or less what could happen in the book. So I have a starting point and I have an ending that I think that should work, but I don't bind myself to that. For me, the writing process is an expedition of discovery. I need to go find the story in the writing. But you can't just write, you know. I mean, you've got to have some sort of a direction in which you're moving. But that direction, that destination is not fixed. If I write several chapters and I do a lot of research and I find that a different destination would work better for the story, then I change the direction of the story. So it's a fluid process. It's an organic process. It's not an absolutely fixed and planned process. I hate over-planning a story, because I think that robs the characters of the opportunity to take the story where they want to go. It robs me and the creative process of influencing something that I read in today's newspaper or something that I hear someone say tomorrow. I'm always willing to allow that into the story and to see what happens, to have multiple creative choices and to always choose the best one. I know that doesn't make sense, but that's the best I can do.
Well, some authors say that the character starts to live their own life.
Yeah,
Have you had that experience too?
Yeah, it's true, but I think those same authors would also admit that if their own lives start interfering with the story, then you've got to rein them in. There's freedom, but there's discipline. There's control, but there's organic movement. So it's a little bit of both. I mean, absolutely, the characters become very real, very alive. I mean, when you write a book, this last book that I've just published in South Africa called Fever, it took me 2 years to write that book. And for 2 years, just about every day, I spent more time with people who don't exist than I spent with real people. And these fictional characters become very real. I mean, in my head, they become very, very real. So, yes, they have their own lives, their own worlds. Their personality starts to influence the story. And if that is always positive for the story, then I absolutely allow it. But if a character does something that changes the story in such a way that I don't think it's working anymore, then I will impose my will onto the character.
I see. Do you know who is your reader?
Yeah, I'm my reader.
You are?
Readers are so diverse. I mean, all age groups, men and women, Swedish, German, South African, American. The diversity is just too big. So it's impossible to write for any other reader than the reader inside of me. Because the reader inside me must look at what I'm writing and tell me if it works or not. So I am the reader that I write for. And I think all authors do that. It's the only reader that we really know.
Do you have any advice to a young man or woman who wants to be an author?
My first and best advice would be to read.
To read, yes.
Read for 10 years before you start writing. Read everything that you can lay your hands on. Read the very best in the world. And just keep on reading. Read 2-3 books a week. Because that's how you educate the reader within. Because you can only be a good writer if you have an educated reader inside. And educated means a reader that has read the best, so the reader knows what is good and what is bad. I see a lot of manuscripts where you can see that this person has never really read crime fiction, for instance, but they've heard that crime fiction is popular, so they're writing too. So that would be my very best advice.
And tell me about Icarus.
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah, Icarus is coming out next year in April in Sweden. It's a Benny Griessel novel, and it's set in the winelands of near Cape Town. The wine industry has fascinated me for a very long time. Wine has fascinated me because I'm not a huge wine drinker. And the reason for that is that for many years South Africa didn't have great wine. It's only now in the last 15 years that our wine has become really world class. But when I grew up, and even as a young adult, wine didn't taste great to me. So I could never really understand the mysticism and the romanticism and all the other things that made people so keen about wine. But the whole, I mean, the Cape Winelands is the most beautiful part of South Africa. And there's a mystique about it. There's a mystique about the people who own those beautiful big farms. They are the closest to royalty that we have in the white community in South Africa. So I've always been very intrigued. So I wanted to go and explore the wine industry to see if there was a story there. So, you know, for crime fiction, you have to expose the dark underbelly of anything. So I went looking for the dark underbelly of the wine industry, and I found it. I found some very interesting stories, and that's part of what Icarus is about. The other part of Icarus is there's a murder, and the guy who gets killed is a young internet entrepreneur. And I got the idea by reading an article in Time magazine about, and this can only happen in France. There was a Frenchman who started a website where if you want to be unfaithful to your husband or your wife, and you wanted to go away for a dirty weekend and you needed an alibi, you could log onto this website and you could buy an alibi from this website. A French service. So I thought this was so fascinating. So I created a character who starts this in South Africa, and then he gets killed. And obviously there are many people who would like to kill him because of his service. But then quite early on in the book, a wine farmer walks into a lawyer's office and says, I need to talk to you about the death of this guy. But for you to understand why I'm involved, I need to tell you the story of my life on the wine farm from my grandfather's time. So that's really more or less what Icarus is about.
Sounds very exciting.
I hope you enjoy it.
And the book that's translated into Swedish now, that came out in June, I think, Cobra.
Yes.
And there is another of my favorite. Wow. That's Benny Griessel. Yes. An intelligent policeman with a complicated private and professional life. Right. And he's also he's been, what do you say, sober alcoholic?
Yeah, a recovering alcoholic. Yeah.
And he have a sort of sense of humor whom I like, and quite intelligent. He's not very impressed by anybody, which I also like. Yeah. And this is a quite fantastic story. There is an English professor in mathematics who's got kidnapped, and his 3 bodyguards are getting killed by a professional bullet, where there is a cobra splitting on it, somehow. And meanwhile, on the other part of the town, there is a young thief who is using his talents to make it possible for his sister to go through college. Yes. His name is Tyron. I would very much like to read more about him. Right. And somehow, what Benny Grisel can't understand is why the MI6, the British Secret Service, is so occupied by this case.
Yeah.
And it's a fantastic story what's going to happen. Can you tell us a little bit, how did you get this idea?
Right. Yeah, the story came from two sources. The one was 5 or 6 years before I started writing that book, I read an article in the New York Times about how the American intelligence services are using the international banking system to find terrorists. Because terrorists have a very specific financial fingerprint. They use money, they receive and spend money in a very specific way. For instance, if you're a suicide bomber, you're not going to buy a house. So, you know, there are all these little telltale signs in the financial industry of which people might be terrorists. And I was fascinated by this article for several reasons, and I sort of filed it away, and I thought, well, one day I'm going to use that. The other thing that happened was that one of my police contacts told me about a very famous pickpocket in Cape Town who was now officially retired. And I said, well, please, can't you give me his contact details? I'd love to talk to him. So I called up the retired pickpocket and I told him who I was, and he said, sure, come talk to me. And I spent a whole day with a 66-year-old pickpocket who told me the story of his life, and he even tried to teach me how to pickpocket. But he said I was useless because my hands were too big. You needed much smaller hands to be able to pickpocket. But, you know, he was the inspiration for Tyrone, the young pickpocket in the book. So those were the two things that came together in Cobra.
And this Benny Grisel, have you ever met anyone like him in reality?
No. I mean, you know, I've met people who are like him in a certain sense, and maybe in one small way. Actually, when I created him in my first translated novel, Dead Before Dying, I gave the looks of a policeman that I knew. I gave the looks to Benny Grisel, not knowing that Benny would become a protagonist one day. But that's it, really. I mean, he's a pure figment of my imagination.
But when you read the book, you really understand how difficult it must be to be trying to fight alcoholism. You're doing it in a different way than the way sometimes it's very common. It's a cliché sometimes with a...
Well, that's the problem. You know, when I created Benny Grisel, I never thought that he would be a major character. So I didn't think very long, and I made him an alcoholic. But I needed him to be drunk in a certain scene in that book. So later, when I really fell in love with him as a character, and he became a very exciting character to work with, I realized I had the typical, you know, alcoholic cop cliché. So what do I do with this? How do I make this different? And my decision was to really research alcoholism, to really understand the disease and to understand what it's like to live with a disease. The interesting thing is that the woman who translated my first 2 books to English was a woman by the name of Madeleine van Biljon. She was very famous in South Africa. She had a huge personality. She was larger than life. She was a radio personality, very famous on radio. Her voice was very well known. And she was an alcoholic. But she was very open about it. I mean, you know, she told people that she was an alcoholic. When she translated my books, when I read the translation, I could see exactly which parts were translated before lunch and which parts were translated after lunch. But I went to Madeleine and I said, you know, I want to really explore alcoholism as a disease. And I had very long talks with her. She was very generous in her sharing of information. She took me with her to Alcoholics Anonymous meetings, where we asked permission for me to be there. She introduced me to other alcoholics. I spoke to a lot of alcoholic policemen because I wanted to know why so many policemen drink, and it's very interesting why they do, but also how it influences their life and their jobs, and how it destroys their family life, and you know, the struggle every day to not drink.
But why do they drink then?
Well, I don't think there's just one reason, but I think the main reason is that it's a way to cope with the post-traumatic stress that they are always under. You know, their jobs, I think especially police, women and men in South Africa, their jobs are very stressful, and it's a way to cope. It's a way to keep away the demons. Because they tell me that if you work with murderers and violent crimes every day, then you start believing that your own family is in constant danger, and you feel you have to protect them, but you can't always be at home to protect them. And it's that kind of stress, that kind of syndrome that really is very damaging.
Have you read any Swedish crime stories?
Yes, I have. Obviously, I read Stig Larsson. One of my favorite Swedish crime authors is Johan Theorin. Is that the right pronunciation? I've read him. I've also read some others. I'm going to forget the names now, but yeah, I've read quite a few.
Yeah. Could you mention any other of all those famous crime writers around the world that you like to read?
Well, you know, I started reading Ed McBain when I was 14 years old. He passed away 6-7 years ago, but I still think he was the greatest crime fiction author ever. I have great respect. I love the work of Michael Connolly, Ian Rankin, Robert Harris, although he isn't specifically crime fiction. He writes suspense thrillers, and I admire him. I love Lee Child's books. I mean, there are so many. I'm going to forget a lot of important ones now.
I was thinking that Robert Harris' books reminds me a bit of what you were writing.
Oh, wow, that's a great compliment.
Yeah, I think so, because, for example, this ghostwriter.
Right, yeah.
He's taking things out of what's happening in the world and put it in a very exciting story. And I think you do about the same.
Oh, thank you. I appreciate that.
He's also a very nice person.
I've never met him, but I'm a great fan.
Yeah, he's a very charming person. So, when you said that you were going up 4 o'clock in the morning and just working 2 hours and then taking care of the children and so on, how do you work? How does it look a day for you?
Right. Well, I'm happy to say that the kids are all grown up now, and I've got a wonderful wife now who helps me a lot. But these days, I get up at 5:30 in the morning, so I start writing quite soon after that. And it all depends on what stage the book is in. You know, when I start a book, the first half of a book, it's slow writing, it's very hard work, so I write until lunchtime, 7 hours more or less, and then usually I'm quite tired. But in the second half of the book, I start writing more and more hours every day, because the book just starts consuming you. And the last quarter, I sometimes write from 5 o'clock in the morning until 10 o'clock at night.
Oh.
Because, you know, the book just, it absolutely dictates your life, and you want to finish it, and your whole life consists just of what's happening in the book.
And what was ever? I read an interesting story the other day. The Worldwide Fund of Nature has sending a report that in 4 years, half of all elephants, lions, and tigers are going to be exterminated. Have you also heard about that?
Yeah, I have. I mean, we see it in South Africa. You know, the number of lions that live freely are now so small that it's pitiful. The number of elephants too. I mean, there are just too many human beings in the world, you know. So the area where these animals can live freely are just getting smaller and smaller. It's something that saddens me greatly. I think it's already too late to save the African wildlife. I think it's too late already. I just don't think. I think my grandchildren will not be able to see, well, maybe my great-grandchildren will not be able to see lions and elephants and rhinos living in the wild. They will see them maybe in a zoo. But I'm afraid we are destroying this planet completely. And now, I mean, Donald Trump, who says that there's no such thing as global warming, that is very bad news, you know. It's terrible.
Yeah. And what do you do when you don't work?
I don't think writers ever not work. You know, even when I'm on holiday, I'm thinking about the next book that I want to write. But my wife and I, we love mountain biking, so we try and ride.
She's also mountain biking?
No, mountain biking, that's bicycles.
I see.
So we try and ride at least an hour every day. And when we do take a holiday, we love going to France and the French countryside, French cuisine, that sort of thing. I love cooking, I love watching movies, I love reading and walking in nature, that sort of thing.
Are you sure you just have 24 hours?
Yeah, you know, you got to be very disciplined, but I do take holiday where I don't write.
Oh, I see.
And then I do all these other things.
Last time when you were here, you told me that you wanted to be an ambassador for South Africa when you're traveling abroad.
Yeah.
And I have somehow understand that you have changed your mind a bit. Why?
No, I haven't changed my mind about being an ambassador for South Africa, because South Africa is a country and South Africa's people are incredible. And why I love to be an ambassador for tourism to South Africa is that tourism is our biggest industry. And the more tourists we get, the more jobs we create for very poor people. And the more foreign currency we earn so that we can fight poverty in South Africa. What I have changed my mind about is that, I mean, I was a great supporter of our new ANC government under Mandela. He was a fantastic president. And even President Mbeki, although he did not believe that AIDS was caused by a virus, he was not a bad president. But unfortunately, our current president is the Donald Trump of Africa.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, he's not been a good president. He's a corrupt man. He's a man who is destroying our country. So I still am I love my country still very much, and I'm still an ambassador for the tourism and the people of South Africa, but I am no longer a supporter of the ANC government.
And how do you look upon the future of South Africa?
Well, I'm still very positive, because I think there are several things that work in our favor. First of all, we have great people. Secondly, we have a very strong civil society in South Africa. We are now seeing that more and more people are voicing their disgust with our president. The pressure on him to resign is getting bigger and bigger on all levels of South African society. Thirdly, we have freedom of speech, and we have free press, and a very good free press. And fourthly, we have a wonderful judiciary that's independent. The judiciary has now several times told the president in court cases that he's wrong and he can't do certain things, that have stopped him from doing certain things. So those are the things in our favor, and I think that is what should pull us through eventually. So I'm still positive.
Oh, great. I wonder if someone wants to ask a question. There is somebody?
Sorry, will it just get the mic to you?
I know that you love Benny Griessel, and I don't mind, but there are other people that I do like even more. And I wonder, have you stopped writing about the SAPS? Won't we ever hear about Mbala, for example?
No, Mbali is in Cobra. Mbali is in the new novel Icarus.
But after Fever, I mean, I read them all, so...
okay, no.
There's nothing
Fever, every few years I just need to give everybody a vacation. Benny Griessel, Mbali Kaleni, Tubela, everybody. And I need to give myself some breathing room to just write something different. So I've written Fever, who is about other characters, but I'm already busy now with a new Benny Griessel. Mbali is in there, Von Cupido is in there.
Will he meet Tiny again?
Well, yeah, probably. I'm planning a tiny novel after that, so yeah.
And how about Lemmer?
Well, Lemmer is still on holiday. We'll see.
And then I have another question. When I read Trackers, I was very impressed by the way that you present Milla Strachan. So I was wondering if you actually were surrounded by women when you grew up. And now you just speak about your brothers, but where does your empathy for women come from?
Oh, I love women.
I know. I know.
No, I mean, I
realized you did.
I had 3 brothers, but I have a wonderful mother. She's still alive. She's 85 years old. And, I've had the privilege of knowing some really wonderful women in my life. My wife is probably the most wonderful woman in the world. So, yeah, it's...
That's one of the best things about your book.
Thank you.
Actually see that you do love women.
Yeah.
Thank you for your books.
Thank you very much.
This could be a Swedish press conference. People aren't asking anything.
We seem to have covered everything comprehensively.
Yeah.
Let me just say one more thing. I was very surprised this morning. We had a book meeting in Malmö, and a gentleman came up to me and he said he loves coming to South Africa, and every time he goes there, his Swedish friends ask him if he's crazy because it's so dangerous. Isn't he afraid of getting mugged or killed, or isn't he afraid of getting AIDS? And it greatly saddened me, because I think one of the reasons why people don't come to South Africa is because they get all this negative news, and they have a very negative perception of Africa in general, and then South Africa too. So let me be an ambassador for a few minutes and say that, just to put the record straight, you will not get AIDS in South Africa. We have AIDS firmly under control. The number of AIDS cases are going down all the time. Secondly, for the crime statistics for visitors from the Northern Hemisphere is some of the lowest in the world. More tourists get killed every year from Europe, get killed every year going to Thailand than in South Africa. I mean, much more. We're talking about 90% more. The crime statistics for people from the Northern Hemisphere, that's America or Europe or Scandinavia, going to South Africa is about the same as the crime statistics in Ireland or in Wales. So if you're afraid to go to Wales, don't come to South Africa. It's the most beautiful country in the world. We have so many different cultures and ethnicities. We have so many climate zones. We have the Mediterranean zone down in the Cape that is extremely beautiful. We have the Karoo, which is semi-desert, and it just takes your breath away. We have the subtropical east coast of Durban. We have the Knysna forest that is spectacularly beautiful. We have mountains, and then up north we have all these incredible game reserves that you can go to. And the best thing of all is that our currency is very weak. So to come to South Africa is like almost having a holiday for free. We have better restaurants, or as good restaurants as you have in Europe. We have spectacularly good hotels. So don't be afraid, and just come and enjoy South Africa. It is a fantastic country.
Deon, I have been there.
Oh, so can you?
I can tell that.
Okay.
It's true.
Okay.
Of course it's true.
I pay her a lot of money to say that.
Well, thank you very much for coming.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you very much.